Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. And back this morning is the incomparable Dan Balz, chief political correspondent of the Washington Post. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Jonathan.
I'm glad to get a chuckle out of you, considering that what we're going to talk about is rather somber. Today, President Biden, Vice President Harris are headed down to Atlanta. What should we expect from this trip when originally they were supposed to be going down there to talk about the American Rescue Plan, and now they're slated to meet with Asian American business, the Asian American business community, who are in mourning over the shootings this week um, of of 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian American. What should we expect from this visit now?
Well, this is a quite different trip than the White House originally had planned. It was obviously intended to be part of the victory lap from the passage of the American Rescue Plan and to highlight the fact that the promises made during the Senate campaigns for $2,000 checks have come true with the additional $1,400 that's included in the American Rescue Plan. But all of that changed with the shootings. And this is a much more serious and somber trip that the president and vice president will be taking. These killings have obviously shaken the Asian American community and more broadly the Atlanta area, and I think the rest of the country has been shaken by this. And they will be paying tribute to the victims, offering sympathy and empathy. The president, we know, is quite good in this role. He is a person of enormous empathy, and he will be able to bring that to the community when he goes down there. But again, this is a quite different trip than they had envisioned.
You know, we saw the hearings on the Hill yesterday about anti-Asian American violence that's been happening around the country. Atlanta and the Atlanta area, that was not the first time we have seen violence against that community. And we saw sort of tensions erupt when you had specifically Republican members on the panel basically claiming, our language is being policed as a result of this hearing. There's a debate in the country as to whether this is a hate crime, and that's a legal definition. There's some folks looking at the White House having stopped short of also saying that they believe that it is a hate crime, what happened in the Atlanta area. What do you make of this, and why do you think the White House hasn't gone as far as, say, the general public has in characterizing what happened?
Well, I think we're talking about two different things or two related things, Jonathan. One is obviously the legal definition of what constitutes a hate crime, and therefore what can be charged as a hate crime. And I think that there's question at this point about whether that is the case here, as to whether this can be charged as a hate crime. On the other hand, what we know is from the past year, there have been repeated attacks of all kinds, both verbal and particularly physical, against Asian Americans since the pandemic hit. And since the pandemic was described by the former president as the Wuhan flu or the whatever, and that has created a kind of a supercharged environment in which Asian Americans feel justifiably targeted because of this. So there is a language debate, and we're in the middle of a debate more broadly around the country about what kind of language can be used in what kind of circumstances. But there's no question that these killings have created even a greater sense of fear among Asian Americans about their own standing in this country.
Let's talk more again about the original reason why the president and vice president were headed down to Atlanta. It was to champion the American Rescue Plan. Why Georgia specifically?
Well, as I said, I mean, Georgia was ground zero for the Democrats being able to take over the Senate, and Biden, when he campaigned on behalf of Senators Warnock and Ossoff, made it clear that if they were elected, people were going to get $2,000 checks, that the Democrats would have the votes, they would have control of the Senate, and they would be able to get this through. And so returning to Georgia to remind people of that. I mean, one of the elements of this trip, along with others that the vice president and the president have been taking, is not simply to champion the American Rescue Plan, but to make sure that people understand everything that's in it, that there are all kinds of benefits, if you will, that are going to flow to middle class and other Americans, particularly the poor, in terms of child poverty, the child tax credit. And they want people to understand what's in that, and certainly they obviously want credit. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that the Obama administration did not get enough credit for the stimulus package that was passed in the early days of that administration, and they're taking another page from that book and saying we're going to do things differently, and we're not going to take for granted that people will understand it. So going to Georgia was a way to highlight that, and obviously Georgia is a critically important state in our electoral system at this point. It's becoming a more purple state. Biden won it, and now the two senators have won it, and so they want to continue to drive forward on that to try to push their support higher if they can possibly do it.
Dan, let's talk about immigration, because we've seen a growing number of unaccompanied minors crossing into the United States from Mexico every day, creating a humanitarian crisis there on the southern border. How's the Biden administration handling the influx?
Well, I think it's fair to say that at best that they're struggling with it. I mean, this is something that has hit them very, very rapidly, and they were not fully prepared for it. They were not fully prepared in part because of things that happened during the Trump administration, and the degree to which the processing system was inadequate for what they are now facing. But they're also facing it in a political sense, which is that they want to show that they are being more humanitarian than they say that the Trump administration was. The Trump administration obviously separated families and was condemned for that and had to change that policy. And this administration is trying to show a different side, a different face with regard to things that are happening at the border. And yet, they have to enforce the laws. The laws say if you come across illegally, you have to be sent back. Unaccompanied minors, they are not doing that. They say they are doing it with adults and with most families, but not with unaccompanied minors. But the processing is slow. They're not moving them into other facilities as quickly as the law would say, and they are struggling with it. And they are under pressure both from the right. The Republicans have seized on this as a border that's out of control because President Biden wants, in effect, open borders, which the administration denies, but nonetheless the Republicans are pushing that. But they're also under pressure from the left. The progressive wing of the party say that they do not want to return to the kind of deportation strategy that existed under President Obama. Obama came under criticism for the number of people who were deported, and this administration is buffeted by that as this surge, what could be a record surge, continues.
Dan, you covered just about every follow-up question I could have asked. I'm going to squeeze in one more topic, and that is infrastructure. The big conversation has been that once you got the American Rescue Plan through, the next big thing was going to be infrastructure. Do you think a major infrastructure bill is next in line for Congress's agenda?
Well, there's some logic to that, but I don't know that that's the case. I mean, the last soundings I took on this, which have not been in the last few days, indicated that the administration was not quite clear as to what the next big thing they were going to try to do. Obviously, I think they would like to do something that would bring some more bipartisan support. A lot of people think that could be infrastructure, but the more people dig in on the infrastructure issue, the more it's clear that there are important differences between Republicans and Democrats in how you structure it and how you pay for it, and perhaps even the size of it. So it's not necessarily clear that our infrastructure package would be the way to bring unity to a very, very divided country. So I think that's one of the choices the administration will have to make.
Bringing unity to a very divided country through legislation. Dan, you know what? We're going to have to do, just you and I, our own special on filibuster reform, because that's what all of these conversations are leading to. But Dan, as always, we are out of time just when we're up and getting up to speed. Thank you very much for coming back to First Look. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Jonathan. You too.
Now, let's head over to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find my colleagues and columnists, George Will and former Maryland Congresswoman Donna Edwards. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Donna, good morning. Donna, I will start with you. As I started the conversation off with Dan, the nation's been reeling following the killing spree in Atlanta. What do you make of the fights over whether the shootings are a hate crime or should be considered a hate crime?
Well, I think that Dan was right to point out the distinction between what is, falls under the statute as a hate crime and what Asian Americans across the country have been experiencing, particularly over this last year, when it comes to an increase in assaults and violence against Asian Americans that I think has been driven by rhetoric that's come out of the White House and into the front pages and on the news channels. And so I think we're going to have to wait to figure out whether authorities will be able to charge as a hate crime. But what we do know is that the violence and hate against Asian Americans has escalated and it has to stop.
George, what do you think? And what do you think of the charge that the divisive rhetoric used by Republicans, and particularly by the previous president, to describe the coronavirus are the cause for the rise in attacks against Asian Americans, as Donna just pointed out?
I think it's really hard to establish social causation from presidential rhetoric to a disturbed person shooting someone in Atlanta. Whether the use of the description Asian flu or Wuhan flu or China flu contributed to a national increase of attacks on Asians is, again, that's more suggestive but hard to demonstrate. You know, the Spanish flu that killed far more people than this is going to kill worldwide was called the Spanish flu, although Spain had absolutely nothing to do with it 100 years ago. It would have been more accurate to call it the Kansas flu, because there's evidence that it began in a military base in Kansas and was taken to Europe with some American soldiers in the First World War. I'm very skeptical, Jonathan, about the very concept of hate crimes. I'm leery of the government deciding to enhance penalties or enhance the gravity of an offense because of the mentality of the person committing the offense. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it gets the government into dangerous territory.
Donna, I will give you an opportunity to respond.
I think in Congress, we always start out with all due respect. I mean, I completely disagree with this characterization. Part of the reason that we have a hate crime statute at the federal level and that many states have enacted hate crime statute is because hate crimes occur. And if you've ever been part of a community where that kind of vitriol and violence has been directed at it because of who you are, I think it's important for governments, whether state or federal, to step in and say that these are the kind of things in a free society that we're not going to accept, and put out enhanced penalties for them. I mean, if you just look at the numbers alone, that over the course of the last 4 years, there has been an escalation of hate crimes, crimes of violence against particular groups over these last couple of years. And I think that it's important for government to step in and to do something about it. I mean, this kind of violence, and we're going to wait to see what the ultimate classification is, but we know that violence has increased over Asian Americans, and whether you're going to attribute cause or not, it's important for leaders to display the kind of language that doesn't contribute to the problem. I mean, we can't control what everyone says, but as leaders, presidents in an Oval Office can control what they say.
And I'm going to stick with you here, Donna, because watching the video from the hearing yesterday, about anti-Asian American violence and some of the things that were said by members of Congress, particularly Republican members of Congress, had me wondering, and this is the question I have for you, and that is, why is it that when people of color raise their voices on behalf of our humanity and our dignity, it's called quote unquote cancel culture? One, and two, how can we have productive conversations that are needed to heal and to change when one side openly doesn't care about our humanity, or more offensively to my mind, change the subject?
You know, Congresswoman Grace Meng yesterday really articulated it, and she said that she was not going to allow one member of Congress or groups of members of Congress to close down her voice. And I think it's incumbent on those who can to lift up the voices of people who are feeling discrimination or feeling violence. And, you know, this notion of like cancel culture, I don't even know that I completely understand it. What it means to me sometimes is that you don't want to have the conversation and you want to dismiss the concerns of a community. And where it concerns, you know, one of the things that we haven't really talked about is that there are provisions, and the Violence Against Women authorization was actually passed in the Congress this week, but there are provisions in there that deal with hate crimes against women. And so while we may not be able to articulate a hate crime against Asian Americans in this case, there were 6 Asian women who were killed, and we need to look at the underpinnings of that. And I don't think that you can just dismiss the concerns of a community because you don't want to talk about
it. George, there were contentious, I mean, surreally and unbelievably contentious talks in Anchorage between top officials from the United States and China yesterday. I saw some video of it, and I hadn't seen anything like that in a very long time. What does this suggest to you about relations between the two countries moving forward?
I think contentiousness, which in this case is candor, is often good. Lord Curzon, a great British diplomat, once said, the secret to diplomacy is know your own mind and make sure the other guy knows it too. Before he became even vice president, Mr. Biden had very strong views about President Xi. He said there's not a democratic bone in his body. Mr. Biden has changed the rhetorical tone of relations with Russia. I mean, to call Putin a killer is A, accurate, and B, I think helpful, for the same reason that Ronald Reagan was accurate and helpful when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world, which he did because he thought that détente in the 1970s had drained the Cold War of an important moral dimension that he wanted to reestablish. And I think it's entirely sound for the Biden administration to make clear to China that we have extraordinary differences in our domestic values that are going to inevitably condition foreign policy, particularly with regard to the most dangerous place in the world, I think, which is that portion of the South China Sea near Taiwan. The American policy toward Taiwan for many years, decades really, has been strategic ambiguity. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration decided to be less ambiguous about America's commitment to the safety and independence of Taiwan.
Let me stick with you here on this, George, because, excuse me, because after 4 years where we've had a president and a White House that was more oriented to authoritarian regimes rather than our allies, how is the strong language from the Biden administration, particularly in those contentious talks, how's that language being received on the world stage? And is it possible for the United States to regain its place and the stature as being the leader of the free world?
Well, it's an interesting, some would say, anachronism you're using there, the free world. Which was a more denoting noun when the world was divided into two camps. I assume that the increased, as I say, candor and you say contentiousness between the United States and China will cause some of the people in the foreign ministries of our European friends to repair to the fainting couches. But they're not. They're not at the center of this. This really is what's at the center of this is what is now being called the Quad: Australia, the United States, Japan, and India. An enormous population in those four countries, an enormous economic power in those countries. And those are the ones who have, it seems to me, a common interest in confronting an assertive China.
You know, Donna, I saw you nodding at the beginning of George's answer when we were talking about the meetings of candor in Anchorage. I saw you nodding in agreement with George. Give you opportunity to weigh in here.
Well, I was, because I do think that I agree with George that I think it's important to have clarity, not just for the two negotiating parties, but also clarity for the world. I think it, you know, there has been a lot of sort of up and down in our relationship with China, and it hasn't always been clear, you know, sort of what we want that to be, particularly over the last 4 years. And, you know, while some, I mean, you described it as contentious, I think that that actually is the nature of how you conduct diplomacy and negotiations with an adversary, and China is an adversary. It's not an ally, and so that kind of, you know, sort of clear-headed thinking, and hopefully it will continue in terms of policy, will be helpful both to the United States but also to the rest of the world.
So, Donna, again, I'm going to stick with you with the broad question. When do you think we'll see comprehensive immigration reform? And we're talking about this now because, one, of the surge on the border of unaccompanied minors, but then we also had yesterday in the House a pair of very popular immigration bills passing, which would offer a path to citizenship for 3 million undocumented immigrants who've been in the United States for years. So when do you think we will see comprehensive immigration reform?
Well, Jonathan, even if I were in Congress, I would probably not be able to answer that question. But, you know, the House put forward its kind of opening argument for immigration reform, and hopefully there will be more to come. I think in the Senate, it's very clear to me that the only way to get through some of these issues, and Dan pointed to a couple of them, and especially immigration and comprehensive reform that's really targeted at the problem, is only going to come, I think, if we, you know, get filibuster reform. I don't see how you move 8 to 10 senators across on this issue and on a number of others without that. And it's really a shame, because up until in recent years, immigration reform had always been able to galvanize some bipartisan support, and certainly from Ronald Reagan to George Bush and beyond. But I don't see those numbers there now. I don't see 60 votes in the Senate, but I see 51.
What do you think, George?
I think that when Congress attaches the adjective comprehensive to a noun, any noun, healthcare, immigration reform, whatever, look for trouble. Why not take bite-sized nibbles at this? The Gang of Eight, in 2013, I believe it was, Donna, the Gang of Eight put together comprehensive immigration reform, 1,197 pages long. And of course, it all fell apart because they tried to solve everything at once. We have two things we can address right away. One is the dreamers, those children who came here through no fault of their own illegally and have been living well and ought to be legalized. Another one is what to do about the approximately 11 million people who are in the country unauthorized. Now, 2/3 of them have been here 10 years or more. 21% have been here 20 years or more. They're not going home. They are home. Now, the problem is once you say we're going to put them on a path towards citizenship, some people start screaming amnesty, and that short circuits the entire discussion. But the fact is the American people in their native decency would not tolerate for an instant the police measures that would be necessary to extract 11 million people from the communities into the fabric of which they are woven. So surely if Congress would just address those two matters, Dreamers and the regularizing the status of the 11 million people who are here illegally, that would go a long way toward diffusing the issue, and then you could go on to steps 3, 4, and 5.
George, that is eminently reasonable. And in a rational world, I'm like, you know what, George Will is right. Bite-sized pieces, moving right along, and you'll pull Republicans along more than likely. But the real world that we're in, to me at least, and disabuse me of this if it's not true, the real world that we're in is one where Republicans are not going to work with Democrats and not work with President Biden to get anything done that would be perceived as a win for him as opposed to a win for the nation. Am I wrong?
Yes, I think you are wrong. I think there are a number of Republicans who think like that, but not entirely. I mean, they just don't. And I think immigration, like infrastructure and a lot of other issues, is a realm of splittable differences. And I do not think that you can simply say 50 Republicans are opposed to anything that would give the Biden administration satisfaction, and therefore the solution is a procedural reform of the filibuster. I think that's factually mistaken.
But George, in order to get to that 51, you got to get to 60. To the former Congresswoman's point, who are the 10 senators who are going to cross over and join the 50 Democrats to overcome the hurdle that would make it possible to have simple majority votes on very big issues?
The Dreamers is an 80-20 issue in this country. 80% of the American people are in favor of such. Let's start there and see what happens. Let's begin to develop the muscle memory in the mind, if you will, of how to split differences and get on with things.
Okay, so Donna, on that point, yes, Dreamers are an 80-20 issue in this country. But background checks for gun purchasers is like a 90-10 issue, and that can't get through Congress.
You know, Jonathan, as George was talking, I was actually thinking about background checks. This is not, I think in an ideal world, what George described actually would be quite comprehensive. Dreamers and 11 million people who are here, who aren't going anywhere, who are woven into the fabric of our nation. But the fact is that this is being driven, I think, in the Senate by the politics of the numbers. How do Republicans regain the majority? And I think in Mitch McConnell's own words, they don't do that by going along with things that are going to elevate Joe Biden and the Biden administration, despite the fact that it would actually elevate the American people and people in our communities. So, those issues, I mean, the American Rescue Plan was a 78% issue, and yet there was opposition, uniform opposition in the Congress. So this is about politics. This is not about how the American people really feel about issues.
George, I got to squeeze in one more thing in the less than 2 minutes that we have. Yesterday, I believe on Wednesday, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain indicated to the Congressional Progressive Caucus that the administration might be amenable to a tax on the wealthy. Do you see that happening?
Taxing an unpopular minority is always polls well, and the wealthy are an unpopular minority. The top 1% of American earners pay 39% of the income tax. The top 5% pay 60%. The top 10% pay 70%. The bottom 50% of Americans pay 3% of the income tax. They're essentially not participating in the income tax system. So I think they will try to tax the wealthy. This, just as cutting taxes is a Republican reflex, taxing the rich is a Democratic rhetorical reflex.
All right, Don, I'm going to let you get in here. We're going to go a little bit of extra time. I hear you on those numbers, George. But if the bottom 50% are 3% of the taxes paid, Donna, am I right in thinking, but the bottom 50% are paying more of their earnings in taxes?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, here's the reality. If it's 39%, well, give them an extra 1 or 2%. I don't think that the wealthiest will feel the pain, and we can get infrastructure done. We can deal with some of the significant priorities that we have. And, the billionaires will still be able to buy another yacht.
And with that, we're good. Go ahead, George. Last word.
Jonathan, you could confiscate every penny of all the billionaires in the country and not pay for the infrastructure needs of this country. The money is in the middle class. If you want money, have the courage of your dubious convictions and tax the middle class.
This is so great. Of course, we have no time to keep going down this road, so we're going to have to leave it there. George Will, former Congresswoman Donna Edwards, as always, thank you very much for coming back to First Look. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you. Thanks.
And as always, thank you for tuning in. Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find out about our great lineup next week, including Matt Damon on preserving our water systems, North Dakota Senator Kevin Cramer, and Congresspeople Judy Chu and Mark Takano on combating anti-Asian racism. Join me tonight for Brooks and Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. Check your local listings. And then join me on Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern for the Sunday Show on MSNBC. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you very much for tuning in to First Look on Washington Post Live.